Okay, so today we're going to be talking about mastering your music for clarity and loudness. Most of what I'll be talking about today, I've learned from other YouTube channels as well as querying ChatGPT and just trial and error over the years. Uh, so first, we're going to talk about the mastering process for individual channels. Then we will dive into mastering on the main bus. There are six main areas of processing we'll be focusing on in this video. There's the drums, the bass, lead instruments, vocals, gain staging, and then main channel mastering. Okay, so first up we have the drums. For EQing on the drums, I tend to use the default 30 hertz. I actually do the same on the bass. Most of my EQing for the bass and drums actually happens on the master channel. We'll get into that later. Um, in the drums though, I tend to use a drum bus for saturation. Basically, I use this over a saturator because it gives you more control over the different characteristics that are specific to the drums, such as like the boom control and dampening, transients, crunch, all of that. Um, and then I tend to set everything to bass mono. Um, Depending on whether I have a lot of hi-hats or if it's just like bass drum, I'll either use bass mono or I'll just use straight mono. If you use straight mono, it might impact how your hi-hats and other elements in the higher frequency range sound. So it's kind of up to you, but generally speaking, either mono or bass mono will work for this. And then generally I have a compressor. I tend to have the compressor on every channel. And all I'm trying to do is cut about 2 decibels of gain reduction. I use a very fast attack so that that cut happens immediately. Set the release to auto, and then make sure that peak is selected and not RMS. You want to make sure that when you're doing gain reduction for peak accumulation, that you're actually setting that value in the compressor. If you set it to RMS, it's going to target the audible range of the volume, and that's not what you really want to do. You want to target the actual peak of the sound, which is basically going to be inaudible for most sounds. That being said, there are some sounds that are very sustained. So basically, if your threshold doesn't come down, or rather if the gain reduction doesn't come back down to 0 and it's just constant, then cutting 2 decibels at the top of that means that you're really cutting into the sound itself, like into the actual audible part of the sound. And so generally speaking, that 2 decibel cut, it needs to return to 0 to make sure that you're only cutting the very tip of that peak signal. Okay, so over on the bass, I don't tend to use sidechaining for my bass because I don't really like the pumping effect that it gives. My EQing though is very similar to the drum EQ. Sometimes I will EQ out the higher frequencies if it's a bass that has a lot of higher frequencies. In this particular case, that high frequency will fight with the leads and the vocals, so I'll cut that out. But most deeper bass sounds, I tend to just leave it at the default of around that 30 hertz cut. And then, of course, saturate again. Of course, this is not the drum bus anymore, so we're using a regular saturator. I tend to aim for 5 to 8 decibels of saturation. This brings out the harmonics and the clarity. It really makes each instrument sound distinct in your mix. On the bass, mono is going to avoid phase cancellation. It makes room in the stereo field for other instruments higher in the frequency range. So basically, as you go up into the frequency range, you're going to apply more stereo width. But in these lower frequencies, such as the drum and bass, you want to keep it in mono as much as possible. And then we have a compressor again, and it's the same as before, cutting 2 decibels of the gain. Yeah, and that's going to essentially create more headroom for when we get into our mastering phase. When you're compressing for peak reduction, you always want to make sure that the compressor is set into peak mode, and you want to use a very fast attack so that you're basically cutting that transient as soon as it happens. And then I tend to use the regular 4:1 ratio, which is basically default. and then release as auto. And that will help you to create more headroom. Okay, so over on our lead instruments, we're going to start with the EQ8 again. This time we are cutting higher up into that frequency range. And the main thing here is to cut out any inaudible data that won't necessarily be heard, but it will still eat up headroom and it'll trigger your compressors and your limiters. So yeah, you want to EQ out whatever low-end information might be there that's just essentially eating up space in your mix. Then once again, saturate 5 to 8 decibels, brings out the harmonics and the clarity. And then we're going to go for stereo width instead of mono this time. So basically, the higher up you go in the register, the more you can get away with adding stereo width, and that basically puts each instrument into its own space, and so that you can hear each instrument clearly. Compression is basically the same as before. We're just aiming for 2 decibels of peak gain reduction. In this particular case, I've added some utilities before my stereo width. That's just to kind of bring down the volume before it goes into widening. So as you apply stereo width, you're also going to increase the output volume. And so to prevent distortion, sometimes you'll need to sort of pull the volume down before it goes into the widening utility, just to make sure that you're not distorting your sound. Okay, so over on the vocals, it's going to be pretty much identical to the way that we process lead instruments. You may want to add side chaining compression to your lead instruments so that they don't fight too much with the vocals, targeting about 2 decibels of gain reduction, but using RMS setting instead of peak. RMS volume is what the human ear actually hears, whereas peak is the true peak volume. And so you basically want to use your vocals to kind of bite into the upper frequencies from the other instruments to create additional clarity to your vocals. Okay, so gain staging. Gain staging is basically just pulling your faders down so that the signal going into your mastering chain can be under 0 dB. And you can do this just by selecting all the tracks in your mix. Just control or shift select each individual track, then pull the faders down until the signal going into the master chain is coming in under 0 dB. If you already balanced your mix how you like it, just select all of them and pull the faders down simultaneously to maintain your current mix. So you can just do that and you can see that all the faders will move together. And that will allow you to maintain your mix while at the same time giving you headroom for your mastering phase. Okay, so on the main bus, we're going to start with an EQ again. This time I use a hard knee at 37 Hertz. That basically is going to sort of cut out any of the inaudible, like sort of really deep bass sounds that you can't really hear. You can go down to 35 if you want. Anything less than that, you probably won't be able to hear even on a club system. So cutting at 35 to 37 kind of just makes sense. It cuts out anything that you can't hear, and that it's not going to really even do anything on a club system. Then at 60 Hertz, you want to cut out the boominess. Basically, you can cut it out without causing it to lose too much power. This is going to make your vocals and your lead instruments come in a lot clearer. And you basically want to just do this deep, sharp cut at 60 Hertz. And then you want another deep cut at 100 Hertz. That's this one here. This is going to cut out most of the muddiness in your mix. This cut is slightly deeper than the one at 60 Hertz since it basically covers a broader range. Basically, the muddiness is going to cover sort of like a broader range of the frequency spectrum. And so you want to have a slightly deeper cut for that one. That's really going to enhance the clarity of your vocals and your lead instruments. That's honestly like a game changer for me. So definitely go for that one. And then you want to slightly raise the gain of the frequencies above 1000 Hertz just to bring up the clarity. You don't want to be too aggressive with it. You want to go for subtlety in this case. You don't want your highs screaming at you. So just a very subtle raise to the frequencies above 1000 hertz. And then I have this bass mono here as sort of a catch-all. You don't really need it, especially if you're applying bass mono on your individual tracks. Basically, in order to avoid phase cancellation, you need to basically apply bass mono before the signals combine. So doing it on your master chain doesn't really do much for you. But I do tend to keep this here as a catch-all. And then we have our final saturator. This one I tend to keep it set to 9 decibels, mostly because I produce EDM. But basically, this is going to bring out those harmonics again, but this time it'll happen across your entire track rather than individual instruments. This is really a great way of being able to increase the final LUFS, or the final loudness volume in your track. And it's really a game changer as far as, bringing out the clarity. And then we have the glue compressor. Basically, this is going to help you to level out the volume throughout your track. You really want to be subtle with compression at this stage, though. You don't want to sort of crush the life out of your track. I use a pretty slow attack at like 10 milliseconds. I set the release to auto, and the ratio is a measly like 2:1. But whenever I make a song, the threshold and the makeup gain are usually the only thing I adjust in this part of the mastering chain. Everything else kind of remains static. I tend to target about 3 to 5 decibels of gain reduction in this glue compressor. Okay, so then we have this custom utility that I call the hair trimmer. It's basically created by using a limiter combined with a utility. As the control knob goes up, it first sort of pulls down the ceiling on the limiter. Then on the other side, the utility pushes the output gain upwards as the ceiling comes down. This allows me to maintain around 2 decibels of headroom in my final master while bringing up the perceived volume, or the LUFS. Bringing down the ceiling also brings out harmonics similar to the saturator. You don't want to overdo it though, because this can cause distortion just like a saturator. So I tend to leave this at around 30, which maps to a ceiling of about -4.3 and an output gain of about 2.26. So if I set that to 30, you'll see that that's -4.3 on the ceiling and 2.26 on the output gain of the utility. And then finally, we have the Julian loudness meter. A lot of you probably use this one already. Basically, you can use it to check the final LUFS, or basically the perceived loudness of your track. I do also use a spectrum utility to kind of check the frequency spread. I don't pay too much attention to it anymore though, because I just like to do it by ear. But I know a lot of people, especially if you use like reference tracks, you want to use that spectrum to sort of check the frequency distribution and make sure that everything is coming in at the right levels. But yeah, that's pretty much how I do my mastering. I tend to produce my music and sort of master in one step. If you set up a chain, something like this, then you can basically just save this as your default in Ableton. That way, every time you start a new project, you don't have to do this over again. And like I said, once this is set up, the only thing I ever really modify is like the threshold of the glue compressor and the makeup gain. Everything else is just static. And then for the individual instruments, I will go ahead and adjust as needed. But yeah, that's basically all you really need to do to achieve like a very loud and very clear mix. So yeah, it definitely took me a long time to learn all this information. Coming from different sources like YouTube and ChatGPT and just like trial and error. But I hope this is like really useful to you, and I hope it like improves your music production skills. Like and subscribe for more, and I will catch you in the next one.